unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. On Saturday, India and Pakistan announced a ceasefire ending, at least for now, the latest bout of armed conflict between the two South Asian rivals. The announcement followed the launch of Operation Sindoor, India's response to the April 22nd terrorist attack in Kashmir, which claimed the lives of 26 innocent civilians. India's strike prompted a worrying tit-for-tat standoff, which quickly escalated into the worst conflict between the two nuclear-armed nations in a quarter century. The fighting has stopped for now, leaving policymakers, scholars, and analysts the task of deciphering the longer-term consequences of the recent crisis. To break things down, I'm joined on the show this week by Christopher Clary. Chris is an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center and the rare scholar who has worked India policy from the inside, having done a 3-year stint at the Pentagon. Listeners may remember Chris from his 2022 appearance on Grant Tamasha when we talked about his then new book, The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia. I am pleased to welcome Chris back to the show. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
I should mention to our listeners that Chris and I are recording this on Monday, May 12th. It is 10:40 p.m. where we are in Europe, which is, as Chris was saying before, a normal time to be awake in Europe, but not a normal time to be doing something as serious as this. So very grateful that you could join us, Chris. I know that you've been in very high demand. I want to start with a bit of background. I'm pretty sure most of our listeners have been, doing as we've been doing, which is constantly hitting kind of refresh on social media, reading news obsessively. But for those who may not have been paying close attention, I want to kind of just ask you to give us a quick overview of the recent conflict. Without getting too bogged down in the details, there were a few significant waves of attacks and counterattacks. So I'm wondering, at a kind of macro aggregate level, could you just kind of lay out for us a quick timeline of the major kind of sequence of events?
Sure. Everything I'll say today comes with a caveat that there's a lot we don't know. So we are still learning. The governments of India and Pakistan have put out their narrative of the timeline, but there's some disagreement in those narratives. And there's a lot of things that the governments have not weighed in on authoritatively, or they've not offered evidence to back up their chronology or sequence of events. So let's rewind. We won't rewind back to the 1,500 years ago that the president says the rivalry began, the U.S. President Trump, who has commented often on the crisis in the last week. But let's go back to April 22nd, when there was this horrible terrorist attack on tourists visiting Kashmir, which not only was especially inflammatory because these were people that were there for a celebration, there for honeymoons, there to enjoy themselves and amidst the stunning beauty of Kashmir. But there appear to have been efforts by the gunmen to target Hindus disproportionately, and it led to images and anger when reports came out that 26 people had died. And since the Modi era began, there has not been an attack that has killed more than about 19 people that has not triggered a serious India-Pakistan conflict or crisis. And so when that Pahalgam attack occurred, all of those of us that have watched India and Pakistan for a long time were reasonably confident that we would have another serious crisis. And the question was only how serious it would get. And then we waited. India showed some patience in that regard. But 15 days later, on May 7th, India targeted 9 sites across Pakistan, including notably 2 in Pakistan, Punjab, focusing on facilities that were associated with anti-India militant and terrorist groups, even though many of those sites were not associated directly with the groups that India blames for April 22nd. The sense is India wanted to permanently raise the cost for anti-India terrorism or anti-India militancy to emanate from Pakistani soil. those airstrikes then were met by a kind of surprising, one might even say stunning, Pakistani early military success. Just within hours of those initial strikes, the Pakistan Air Force appears. We don't know. India has not revealed the final tally, but it appears to have downed at least one, in my view, and possibly up to maybe 4 Indian modern fighter aircraft. And some of these appear to have been quite new Rafale aircraft. If the crisis could have stopped there, both sides could have plausibly declared victory, and we would have got out of this more dangerous period that came. But it didn't. The next night, Pakistan appears to have started launching these coordinated drone attacks on Western India. Those attacks appear to have largely failed. But the next morning, India launched a retaliatory drone attack of its own that did at least cause some casualties. By that, I mean injuries among the Pakistan military. And then in one case, the Pakistani government says a civilian was killed. But it also terrorized a lot of Pakistanis who saw these drones flying over their cities or heard the air defense systems responding to them. And those drone attacks in Western India occurred again, though, on the night of the 9th and into the 10th, at which point, and the sequence here becomes a little confusing and the chronology is disputed, but we know there was both an escalation in Indian airstrikes on Pakistani military targets, as well as an escalation of Pakistani strikes in India, including the use of short-range ballistic missiles. It appears maybe none of the Pakistani ballistic missiles made it to their target, though there is obviously some damage on the Indian side, but the damage on the Pakistani side appears to be more severe. That last kind of spasm of conflict appears to have scared the United States, maybe it scared the Pakistanis, conceivably scared the Indians, so they're putting a good face on it, and we got to a ceasefire shortly thereafter.
That was brilliant, Chris. Thank you for doing that. And there's a lot of different threads I want to pick up, but let me just kind of step back for a second. I mean, you have studied conflict in this region more than most people I know. You've written an entire book about the rivalry between these two South Asian neighbors. I think many of our listeners may remember the podcast that we recorded with you a couple of years ago. You had a piece a few days ago in the Times of India, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And the headline of the piece was India-Pakistan rivalry is old, but Pahalgam marked a new chapter. I guess I want to ask you, what are the indicators that you're looking at when making the determination that, we have indeed entered a new phase of the India-Pakistan relationship? When you say it marks a new chapter, explain that for us.
Since the late 1990s, India has struggled to figure out a way to punish Pakistan for what it attributes as being terrorism and militancy that is more or less caused almost entirely by Pakistan. This is hard, by the way, for outside scholars to attribute, because we do know that Kashmiri Muslims have very serious political grievances with the government in Delhi. We know those grievances by and large, caused the insurgency to emerge in the late 1980s without an immediate Pakistani hand, even though Pakistan was very quick to provide assistance once the insurgency got going. But in India, the sense is that Pakistan is responsible for the vast majority of violence that occurs in Kashmir. And I think most outside observers would at least agree that Pakistani-based groups and the Pakistani state probably had a hand in maybe a majority of the violence in Kashmir for the last several years. So why is this a new chapter? It's because India's tried to figure out how to punish Pakistan, but initially it said, okay, how do we do that? We have this really big army and we can pound Pakistan. And so during crises over terrorist attacks in 2001 and 2002, the Indian army had mobilized. But once the Indian army is mobilized and the Pakistani army is counter-mobilized, it's very hard to have a full-scale ground war between two nuclear-armed adversaries without things getting dangerous very fast. And India opted not to pursue that path for reasons that are still debated by historians. And then in 2008, the Manmohan Singh government did another terrorist atrocity with the attack on Mumbai, and it decided not to do anything militarily about it. Now, that is partially because Manmohan Singh wanted to focus on India's economic development, but also his key national security advisors, Shiv Shankar Menon in particular, have argued that the Singh government concluded that if they started a military crisis with Pakistan, it would take the attention away from Pakistani support for terrorism and instead divert the international community to worry about escalation and restraint. So Shiv Shankar Menon argues that India decided not to pursue a military path in order to get more diplomatic pressure on Pakistan. I think we've seen at least some evidence of the logic and how the international community has responded to the events of the last week. But Modi has pursued a different path, and in 2016, he authorized what he called, or what the media came to call, surgical strikes along the line of control in Kashmir. We don't know how successful those were. And then in 2019, he authorized standoff airstrikes on a Jaish-e-Mohammed, an anti-India terrorist group facility in near a place called Balakot. That strike also, it is debated in the open source community whether that strike worked. And so now, in this last week, whatever debate there is about the relative balance of pain that both countries have inflicted upon each other, it's clear that India has inflicted meaningful military pain on Pakistan, and that it has the capability to do so again in the future, and that it has a variety of technological tools to blow up facilities and military hardware relatively deep into Pakistan. And I think in India's ideal, India would now be shifting into a role much more similar to that Israel has in the Middle East.
So, you gave a quote to Bloomberg News for a story they did in which you said that this particular conflict will be the template for the next crisis. And so when you say it is a template, how so? Is it that India has calculated that despite the fact that, you're dealing with the prospects of nuclear war, India has confidence that it can kind of raise the threshold for pain, force Pakistan to incur more significant military costs than most observers had traditionally thought would be kind of acceptable without leading to kind of an escalatory cycle? Is that the template?
It's tough to know in these early days how confident India and Indian decision makers, I should say more precisely, are about how they calibrated in escalation in this crisis. But there's no doubt that standoff air-delivered weapons or missiles launched from the ground that fly through the air before they reach their destination, and drones, all of those things are more easily calibrated than the use of ground power. And so India showed, and its military spokesmen have referred to this in recent days, that it can choose which rung to reach for on the escalation ladder. And while both countries might wind up one or two rungs above where they desired, they didn't wind up 10 rungs from where they desired. And India hopes that it can secure what sometimes security studies theorists refer to as escalation dominance, that at each step in the ladder, India wants to show that it can win at that level. The problem for India is India does have escalation dominance along most of the rungs of the ladder, but it appears that Pakistan has at least as many and possibly more nuclear weapons than India. So at the highest rung of the ladder, you get parity again, and it is unclear how many rungs that parity that shadow of that parity at the very top, how far of a shadow that cast on the rungs below.
You mentioned, and I think we should keep insisting on this caveat that it is still early days, and we know not as much as we will hopefully come to know in the coming weeks and months and years. But you have been going through commercially available satellite imagery. I would refer our listeners to your Twitter account, which has been absolutely indispensable throughout this conflict. And I want to get your sense of your sense of the damage assessment on both sides. What do we know, again, with the caveat of limited information, about the losses each side has suffered? What do you feel confident in saying at this point? Early days, limited information.
You and I have both been university instructors, and sometimes there is an encouragement for students that have had a tough go at things to frame that around what sometimes instructors refer to as a compliment sandwich. So they put something unpalatable and unpleasant to eat in between two nice, tasty pieces of bread. And in a way, the conflict for Pakistan is a sandwich of something unpalatable, where the first day of the crisis, Pakistan's success in using these apparently long-range air-to-air systems brought down very modern, sophisticated Indian aircraft, and Pakistan, didn't have a victory. It lost facilities, and civilians, arguably militants and terrorists, died on Pakistani soil, but it at least maybe fought into India to a draw on that first night of this near war. And then the next period is quite unpleasant for Pakistan, where it is apparently, and again, we have to caveat, just don't fully know, but apparently trying to do things with drones and perhaps short-range missiles to inflict some pain on India on the nights of the 8th and the 9th and the 10th, and it's just not working for them. India is able initially with the drone, this drone strike on the morning of, I guess, the 8th, 9th, able to cause some damage on Pakistani installations, but fairly minor, perhaps meaningful if air defense systems were taken offline, as India claims. Again, tough to know. And then, though, on the 10th, when we have this biggest spasm of escalation, India shows that it can cause meaningful damage on many Pakistani air bases and air radars. And it has done that in subsequent military briefings by showing its own satellite imagery. And then separately, we can kind of check their math because we have a wide array of commercially available satellite imagery that shows the same thing. And on the Indian side, there is in a few places maybe some limited damage, but it is much less. So, one doesn't want to overstate it. Sometimes people are saying that India flattened airfields and devastated airfields. India caused meaningful damage and showed that it has the ability to do more, presumably has not exhausted the weapon systems that allowed it to do that raid, those raids on the 10th. And Pakistan has not demonstrated that. However, once we got to a ceasefire, the president of the United States came in and took credit for that ceasefire, which was contrary to decades of Indian foreign policy of seeking to avoid third-party overt intervention. Third-party crisis management India acquiesces to, but third parties talking about negotiations over lots of different issues, over Kashmir, God forbid, that is something India wants to avoid. And the president has weighed in repeatedly on his desire to reward leaders on both sides for the ceasefire. So equating India and Pakistan, hyphenating India and Pakistan, again, and the nightmare for Indian foreign policy making community and the dream of the Pakistani foreign policy making community. So I would say the bulk of the military campaign, that core period after the first night, before the last night, through the last spasm of fighting, that went pretty badly for Pakistan. And the question is whether the beginning and the end of that near war is sufficiently compensatory for Pakistan to quote unquote win the crisis.
I mean, Chris, what I find so interesting is that throughout the events that you so eloquently narrated, the other thing that really came through in the reporting is essentially the performance of foreign provided technologies, right? I mean, we heard a lot about Turkish drones on the Pakistani side, Chinese made missiles, the Russian S-400 air defense system on the Indian side. Potentially the deployment of the French Rafale fighter aircraft, allegedly one of which may have been downed, perhaps Israeli technology. I mean, this strikes me as kind of a gold mine, right, for intelligence and security operatives and analysts for the years to come, because this conflict is going to give us a lot of insight into how well these technologies performed. And many of these things were at wildly different price points, right? I mean, so the question is, did lower end, quote unquote, technology actually outperform much more expensive kit?
This is the aspect of the crisis that's being observed by people that, don't really care about India or Pakistan, may not be able to locate them on a map. In the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were not excited about Arab-Israeli conflicts, but they did have this feature that they bashed Soviet and American defense equipment against each other in a way that helped validate certain ideas about how that equipment would work under battlefield conditions. And China has undergone this incredible defense modernization in the last 20 years, but a lot of their equipment has not been used in anger, thankfully. But this India-Pakistan crisis, near war, was an occasion for some of that equipment to be used in anger. It was an occasion for Turkish equipment, which has actually been used more frequently in Ukraine and elsewhere, to be used in anger. And, the preliminary read I have is that the vast number of apparently Turkish origin drones that Pakistan bought were not up to the task of defeating the integrated air defense system that India had put together with Indian, Russian, Israeli spare parts all lying around, into something that wound up apparently being successful. Again, all of this caveated by the fact that new data may become available. It's not a surprise. Both countries have indigenous defense industries, but both countries rely on arms imports for the highest end technology. And they use that technology to try to win this conflict with an important proviso. One type of technology that did not come up were the mythical F-16s on the Pakistani side. The F-16s only enter into the narrative to the extent we know, in the sense that the Indian Air Force targeted the base from which the F-16s most visibly operate historically. And there was, I think, a concern on the part of some U.S. policymakers that if an American F-16 again downs an Indian aircraft or attempts to do so, it's just another sign that the U.S. is playing kind of a double game with India as it works to build a durable, meaningful strategic partnership to manage the problems of the 21st century.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, Chris, one question that, as a kind of amateur who's not a security expert by any stretch, one question that I've had is, let's assume the worst case scenario that on that first night, India lost as many as 4 aircraft. Again, that is not a verified fact as yet, but let's just assume, because it's been reported by some international media outlets. In fact, the number 5 has been used, but let's just stick with 4. And then the next day, India successfully takes out, according to the Indians, with maybe some verification, some of the Pakistani air defenses. Why wouldn't that sequence have been reversed? Why wouldn't you first, as India, taken out the air defenses to protect your standoff aircraft, as opposed to doing it as part of a secondary strike?
It is correct that India went in a reverse order, but according to the official Indian statements at the time of the initial airstrike, the reason they did so was to show the incredible restraint that India was operating on, that it needed to punish terrorists, it needed to show that the situation couldn't stay the same, that cost had to be imposed. But India, out of a desire to be restrained for its own interest, as well as because of the request of the international community, was kind of bending over backwards just to kill bad guys. In reality, there's always some janitor, right? A metaphorical janitor at these places. And especially when you bomb them in the middle of the night, you may not get the most senior people. You may just get some lowly flunky, or in many, there's a lot of children that appear to have been on the casualty rolls of that first night. But India did, I think, avoid military targets despite the normal sequencing that air forces might want to do to try to give Pakistan an off-ramp, even if that off-ramp was not particularly attractive. India could say that it had done its best. And in fact, those early days of the crisis, I guess the crisis only lasted 4 days, so the early hours of the crisis, from an outside perspective, it seemed like there was a lot of maneuvering by Pakistan and India not to be blamed if the next rung on the escalation ladder was grabbed.
This kind of gets to the subject of what's true, what's fake, what's real, what's verified. You commented on this a bit online, but this crisis did seem to mark, for me anyway, this kind of new era in the spread of misinformation and disinformation. I remember just WhatsApping and messaging with friends saying someone reports this, but who knows if this is actually true, and there was just a lot of that. Were you surprised by the extent of kind of just pure fake news, right? Like the supposed attack on the Karachi port and so on and so forth. How do you manage these risks when you're an analyst, researcher who is trying to study very fast moving contemporaneous events?
Yeah, I was surprised. I think there's no doubt for those of us that spend time on social media, which is not clear to me, it's like a net beneficial activity at the individual or global level. But for those of us that spend a lot of time on social media, there's no doubt that the changes that Elon Musk made to X, Twitter, whatever we want to call it, have made the misinformation problem worse, because X no longer rewards kind of users that have profiles of being a journalist or having some sort of position of importance, and instead rewards whoever pays, a couple dollars a month to get a blue check mark next to their name. And it has led to a proliferation of so-called, open source intelligence, OSINT accounts, that OSINT Defender, Alpha Defense, all these, not to call any of the, I'm sure, any specific handles I say, I don't want to be libelous, but there's a lot of handles out there, and they all have names like Warhound. And these accounts make money on virality, so long as what they say does not get a little note at the bottom by this Twitter community note police. As long as you can get away without that note, you get money directly proportional to how many eyeballs look at it. And so this encourages exaggeration. It encourages apparently falsehoods. And it also is commingled with a distinct but amplified problem because of the Twitter environment, which is there have always been rumors in war. The problem is that people couldn't easily report on those rumors to the world. They could only report on those rumors to whoever they bumped in on the street. And now reporters who in India and Pakistan are in a very competitive media environment, they also are rewarded by virality. If you can move first on a big story, that may be the difference between your continued employment and not. And so these reporters, these kind of quasi-reporters that fancy themselves as journalists, but maybe don't get a paycheck from a journalistic media firm, they're all putting stuff out there. And in many cases, I have no doubt that they got a WhatsApp message or they got a call that said something occurred. And established reporters contributed to these falsehoods about an attack on the Karachi port, or on the Pakistani side, in the first night there had been a supposed attack on the Srinagar airport that had achieved astounding success, right? So this spilled over out of social media into the cable newsroom. And occasionally it seems like also Pakistani officials sometimes were parroting things that they had heard about on social media. Okay, so we have this kind of perfect bottom-up, technology-driven storm of misinformation that we're all trying to wade through to figure out what is real and false. And there, as an analyst, what I try to do is not be too confident about anything. And I have obviously some framework for how the world works. I have pieces of data. Are they consistent or not? And when a poorly sourced piece of data comes in, I am quite skeptical of it until a better source verifies it. But even then, a better source, it's better if we can triangulate through multiple sources. It's even more complicated in an era when you can fake imagery and videos, right? So there are so many things coming together here that really make it difficult, and we should be humble, and we should change our minds when we have new data, and we should be hesitant to leap on new information, especially if it reaches us from social media.
I want to come to the role of the United States, but I want to do so kind of via the assumption that has been bandied about that the U.S. got involved because they were really spooked about nuclear dynamics. Various media outlets have reported that the U.S. stepped up its intervention after calls between senior officials in the U.S. and their counterparts in Pakistan and India took place. And it's been kind of implicated or hinted that, something that took place in those conversations really spooked the Americans. This suggestion being perhaps America became anxious about the sanctity of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. Does that ring true to you from what you've heard and seen thus far?
So another thing we can be humble about is we don't know how near wars and wars between nuclear weapon states are prosecuted safely. We have no data. The US and the Soviet Union opted to only fight via proxies, never directly. And that is still the case on the US side to this day. That's something Biden talked about repeatedly as he considered how to deal with Ukraine. So what do we have? We have a very serious clash between China and the Soviet Union in 1969 that occurred, and the Soviets apparently considered nuking China in that clash. So it's very serious, even though it probably doesn't technically meet the definition of a war that we use as political scientists. Probably didn't have 1,000 dead on the battlefield, but it was, real stakes. And then we have a conflict near the Indian town of Kargil in 1999, which probably just barely had over 1,000 battle dead, probably meets the definition of a war that we use as political scientists. And the U.S. got real scared in the Kargil War, too, because we saw indications that the Pakistanis were doing something with their nuclear weapon. This has been written about by Clinton administration officials. Both the Indians and the Pakistanis, in their own ways, have said those concerns were overblown, but they were there. The U.S. Was concerned about nuclear moves during a crisis in 1990 between India and Pakistan, before both sides had overt nuclear weapons programs. The U.S. was worried about nuclear weapons in a crisis between India and Pakistan in 1986 and 1987. And it is par for the course that if you have a serious crisis between nuclear weapon states, that they will take steps to prepare their nuclear weapons in case that crisis veers into a horrible direction. And my expectation is it would have not just been verbal communications from the Pakistanis, but there would be other intelligence inputs that would corroborate American fears about nuclear moves. The U.S. understandably spends a decent amount of energy trying to keep track of where Pakistan's nuclear weapons are at, in part because we have very real concerns about Pakistani stability, and in part because these crises do occur. And we see a lot of stuff that happens on the surface of the earth. We hear a lot of communications that happen that go through the electromagnetic spectrum. We're very good at that sort of thing. And the Pakistanis, we know from their leaders in the aftermath of prior crises, sometimes intentionally manipulate that channel. They intentionally move things around to cause concerns for Americans. And as a U.S. policymaker, I would, you don't want to call a bluff that winds up being real. I tell American policymakers when I have a chance to talk to them that I view the prevention of an India-Pakistan nuclear war as a vital U.S. interest, and in part because hundreds of thousands of American citizens are in India all the time. And any nuclear war would kill thousands, obviously millions of Indians. That's the humanitarian stake. But even if you are the most America first person, thousands of American citizens would die in the event of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And that's setting aside any concerns about nuclear winters or other effects.
So, just on this point of kind of the U.S. role, I found it kind of stunning that the Trump administration went in barely 48 hours from basically the vice president saying, this is not our problem to solve, to then, along with the president, Secretary of State Rubio, and others kind of claiming credit for essentially brokering the ceasefire. Again, hopefully we'll know more in the days and weeks to come, but what's your sense of how decisive you think the U.S. role was in actually clinching this agreement between the two sides to lay down their arms, at least temporarily? Of course, the prospect of resumption of fighting is just around the corner. What's your assessment or your best hunch of the role the U.S. played here in the end game?
Milan, you like I have probably been at drinking establishments too late in the evening, and sometimes people might want to get into a fight, and sometimes their friends hold them back from that fight. And it doesn't mean the holding back is what stopped the fight. It was something that the combatants hoped would occur. And my hunch, until there is evidence to the contrary, is that the U.S. provided a channel. There were other alternatives, the Iranians, the Saudis, the Emiratis. There's lots of ways they can talk to each other. But the U.S. provided a channel. The U.S. probably had enough authority to get General Assam Munir on the phone, which not every country on the planet can do. And when both sides, or at least one of the sides, got sufficiently worried about the path they were on, the U.S. may have facilitated a ceasefire that could have occurred through other channels if the U.S. wasn't playing an active role. But since we were there, we have an experience with off-ramp construction, and we set up our little construction crew, and we built an off-ramp to help out Pakistan and or India. And we got to a ceasefire, and we will see how long it endures.
I think the announcement of the ceasefire caught a lot of observers off guard. Just reading the Indian press, reviewing kind of Indian social media accounts, at least among some segments of the Indian population, there's been a backlash, right? Basically with people saying, look, India should have gone further. They should have bombed Pakistan into submission. They sort of gave up the momentum and the upper hand that they had. I'm curious, what are you seeing from the Pakistani press and Pakistani social media? How has the ceasefire gone down there?
Sometimes lessons can be learned unevenly in these societies. That's especially the case when there's a lot of secrecy and media management. There's a holiday in Pakistan called Defense Day, which is about, kind of standing up against India in the 1965 war. But the historical record now suggests that Pakistan started that war. When you start a war and fight to a stalemate, you lose the war. That's how it works. And it took a long time for the record of what happened in 65 to come out. There's still debates about what Pakistan did in 71 in Pakistan. It's still a sensitive topic. As someone that has run through this narrative about the success or the ambiguous success of the 2016 and 2019 crises on India's side, I can tell you the Indian media also is a little worried about a narrative that runs against the government's line on this topic. So whenever people are trying to control a conversation, it's difficult to know what the sincere lessons that are being learned. My sense on the Pakistani side is that at the moment, the U.S. involvement and equating India with Pakistan may have been enough for Pakistan to overlook the very serious, in my view, deficiencies of their military establishment in the days preceding the ceasefire. But I think it is clear that several things that Pakistan tried did not work at the level of efficacy they had hoped for. And that means Pakistan has to go to the drawing board again. And it also means there may be questions about the decision for the political military authorities in Pakistan, and by that I really just mean the military authorities, to push the crisis as deep as it went. But it may take a while for the reverberations of that to be felt, and it could be overtaken by events in the meantime.
Chris, I want to just come back to something that you said earlier, which I found really striking, and it's something that you said to a reporter from the Washington Post, that we may be entering a situation that is much more similar to crises that Israel has experienced in the Middle East over the last 3 decades. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that analogy. What does that mean in the context of this rivalry between India and Pakistan?
For decades, the stated goal of U.S. policy toward Israel was for Israel to be able to maintain a qualitative military edge over any of its potential rivals. And the question is, how much political and stability and safety benefit can you get out of a military edge? Israel clearly has an overwhelming military edge against its neighbors. But until at least 2023, and we can debate the present, Israel couldn't turn that military edge into safety for its citizens. So India may be in a position where it can go out and cause meaningful harm to Pakistan, but it is improbable that India can solve the Pakistan problem. And something I think about often is, what would Israel do with a nuclear-armed Lebanon or a nuclear-armed Syria? It could beat up on those states, but it can't fundamentally solve the issue. And I worry that India's future may be like Israel's present or recent past, that it can cause military harm, but without a political process to get buy-in from Pakistani authorities to fully clamp down on these anti-India militants and terrorists that are operating in Pakistan, it can't keep its citizens safe. And the compensation of being able to cause sadness and fear in your neighbor isn't adequate to the ability to stop sadness and fear in your own citizenry.
Chris, let me ask you one final question. You are a scholar of South Asia. You are a scholar of nuclear dynamics. I'm wondering, you haven't had a lot of time to reflect, but I'm wondering, are there research questions that this conflict triggers for you, right? I mean, to what extent does this recent spate of violence change or update your priors? What are the sorts of things that you look forward to digging into in the years to come, based on what we saw in a relatively short conflict, but I think one which had so many interesting elements to it?
I think there are several aspects that I will follow down, some on the nuclear side, some elsewhere. I'm quite interested in this question of the narratives that set hold in Delhi and Islamabad and India and Pakistan about what happened here, who won the crisis. It's not at all clear to me that it's very possible both countries will believe they exited winning the crisis. And what does that mean for the next crisis? I think part of the reason this crisis was so severe is India wanted to show that it could have and did win the 2019 crisis, right? It was sort of playing this hand with an eye on the prior round of hostilities, and that may occur in the next crisis. And I anticipate that there will be a next crisis. I'm hoping it's a few years from now, but I don't think there is any fundamental strategic stability in the region. I'm going to watch on the more nuclear side. I'm going to watch what Pakistan responds. Like I said, I don't think some of the things they tried worked. It's probably good that it didn't work at some level, because there might have been more casualties on both sides if they had worked. But I think they'll take compensatory moves. I anticipate they might build more missiles, build more nuclear warheads as a way to ensure that they can inflict pain on India when they need to. But we will see what lessons they learn and what acquisitions they make. I'm also interested to kind of circle back on this question of why the U.S. got concerned. I'm also interested in how worried the Pakistanis were during the crisis. As you know, with our colleague Vipin Narang, I'm associated with this idea that India has what we call counterforce temptations, that you have two nuclear states. How do you deal with one another? When there's a stronger state, sometimes they want to develop the capability to disarm or limit the damage the other side's nuclear arsenal has inherent in it. And so Vipin and I argue, India has pursued some technologies that give it some options. Some of these we saw: standoff, conventional munitions, missile defenses that give India options that it might want to use in very deep crisis. And so it's reasonable now that Pakistan knows that India can hit its airfields, India claims that it targeted Pakistani Air Force command and control nodes. It's reasonable for Pakistan to have some worries, and it might be reasonable for India to think that it could do this on a larger scale if it really needed to. So I'm worried about what that means for arms race stability. And the final thing is, how well did India calibrate the nuclear risks it was trying to take? As I mentioned, the Indian military in its briefings over the last 48 hours has said that it intentionally targeted command and control nodes associated with the Air Force. It showed the destruction of an operations center at an Indian air base, at a Pakistani air base, rather. And was there commingling, though? When you hit a command and control node for the Air Force, is that separate in Pakistan from the command and control nodes it uses to make sure its nuclear weapons are usable in deep crisis? Was Pakistan very scared, or was it only instrumentally scared? I think that will take a while for those of us that work on the region to figure out, but it will be an active area of inquiry.
My guest on the show this week is Chris Clary. He's an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. He has spent time at some of the most prestigious national security foreign policy institutions in the country, including the Watson Institute at Brown, the Belfer Center at Harvard. He was a Stanton Nuclear Fellow at the Rand Corporation. He's also served as the Director for South Asian Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Chris, it's been really so enriching to read your thoughts, to read your quotes, to follow you on Twitter, to see you try and separate the kind of signal from the noise. I think this episode is going to be really useful to our listeners who are trying to step back and say, what have we learned from these fragments of information that we've received so far? I know that you've been in very high demand. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I wish we were here to talk about a new peace initiative rather than the other side of the equation.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.